All right, now we're going, hey, welcome to the Augur meeting for February 3rd, 2025. Um, Going to go through, basically the agenda today is, I'll just take out the stuff that came, Adrian. uh, I don't know if seeking distributed pro systems projects is if that was your.
Yeah, I just added that.
All right, so I think the first thing is just, since our group is pretty small today, since most of the CHAOSS community that's often here is traveling, um, how I think we could just start with questions that you have, Adrian.
Yeah. So I'm not sure who was in the group last time. I showed up many meetings ago, but I'm a university student at Rochester Institute of Technology. I'm pursuing a master's in computer science, and I'm kind of trying to find a project to where I've kind of been trying to get a more solid idea of a project to work on for my master's capstone.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I think I'm sort of specifically looking within the topic of distributed systems. I've sort of had a vague idea of like, hey, I think it might be cool given that I was an intern at Red Hat over the summer, and towards the end of that, I was sort of interfacing a little bit with Kali and making some good first issues type contributions to Augur 8 not mostly 8 not. Um, and I think so I was kind of a little bit paying attention to some of the database migration stuff that happened, moving some of the databases from I think it was University of Missouri to
Yep.
some other
That's
data
where
center. Um,
John and I live. Yeah.
and I think I also talked to oh gosh, uh I forget his name, but I talked to someone who basically helped build most of 8 Not
Probably
with
James
Kali. Yeah,
James
James.
Kunstler.
Yeah. Yeah, I talked to him and kind of diagrammed like he just kind of went through a lot of the architecture of that with me. Um and I was kind of thinking like, hey, if I need a project kind of within distributed systems, I wonder if it'd be cool to instead of having Augur 8 not be like just sort of a centralized database model where like any like because there's like a whole wide world of everyone in open source, and if everyone's like, ooh, analyze my repository, this database is just going to grow and grow, and it's going to be a large like it's going to just be a cost for CHAOSS or Red Hat or whoever owns that data center that the database is now in. And so I was wondering like, hey, is there a way to like make it so that each like Red Hat can like monitor the repositories they care about and maintain their own database, and maybe RIT can do theirs, and CHAOSS can do theirs, but then like some like cybersecurity research firm or something could like kind of pull from all those databases into like a cache on their end and then like analyze the whole industry. So like, is there a way to kind of take this metrics data and spread it out so that the communities own it, potentially even on a level as granular as per repository, sort of like how GitHub has the wikis tab that's like a GitHub wiki is essentially just a Git repository behind the scenes. Like, I'm kind of wondering, like, is there this is the more pie in the sky thing, but is there maybe a way to like even use Git like to distribute this data? I don't know, but I'm just trying to pin down. I've got another kind of milestone presentation coming up very soon. I'm curious, like, what in that kind of vein of databases and distributed systems, like, is there anything in there that would be helpful to helping this Augur 8 Not or any of these projects? Just because I think my main goal is just like I want to do something that's actually going to be impactful and not just be another school project that gets forgotten about at the end of the semester.
I mean, I don't know what John thinks, but the idea of federating the database, I believe, would require a pretty significant rethinking of how Augur persists data. For example, in order to do that, I think there would still need to be um, a common store of keys so that when you create an identifier by loading a repo into your database, that identifier for the repo is unique. It would have to be unique across all Augur instances in order to have a chance of doing some kind of physical federation. So in other words, the logical federation would have to come first, and that logical federation would have to include some kind of centralized service for generating keys. That's my first thought, John. I don't know if you have different thoughts about how someone thinking about federating Augur might go about it.
Yeah, so there's a couple points I think brought up. The first one is the idea of sort of, a monolithic database is expensive to run. If I believe that was one of your
Yeah.
points.
That is a
Um,
fact.
and so, you know, the sort of the monolithic nature of Augur's reliance on a single database to connect to isn't necessarily a problem because there are tools that are intended for sort of um, basically sharing the load of a single database instance across multiple cluster workers. And I don't have a lot of experience with those tools, but I know that they exist so that there's a monolithic interface to the database, but sort of in like a Cloudflare way, where there's like multiple levels of access caching. It sort of the database processing actually happens on across multiple different servers. So I don't think that we're necessarily concerned about that. And honestly, with the way that Augur collects data and handles data right now, I don't think we would necessarily get a lot of use out of that. Like it wouldn't necessarily afford us more performance than we already have to use a solution like that. In terms of having Augur connect to multiple database instances, Sean is correct that we would require more determinism in how we generate certain internal IDs specifically. And we've actually had a discussion about this before because one kind of goal that I sort of thought about early on in my involvement in the project was the ability to combine multiple Augur databases. So if you have like repo data collected on this set of repos and then repo data collected on this other set of repos, you can take like the union of the two and create a new database from them. Um, and what would be required to do something like that would be essentially the same thing that would be required for your idea of having separate database instances for different kinds of projects. Augur currently makes the assumption in quite a few places that the database will be the same for all of the data that it collects and processes. So it would require quite a few changes. Not as many from the GitHub side and the GitLab side because those workers all actually now, thankfully, use our ORM schema for the most part. There's a couple hard-coded SQL lines there, but we actually have a lot of models-based database access in Augur on that side. So that would actually be not that difficult probably to gear for multiple database connections. It would just require the logical consistency to be there, like Sean said. However, our API, the Augur API, is quite extensive, especially on in the metrics department. And the Augur metrics endpoints almost all use raw SQL and like direct database connections from at least the last time I looked at them,
Yeah.
which
No, they
admittedly has
do.
been a long time.
They absolutely do that. Yeah.
And so those would require quite a bit more work, I think, in order to ensure that like they are like if they get a request for a particular repo, they know which database to go to for that, as opposed to having it like abstracted into some sort of model schema like we have for almost the rest of Augur. So that the metrics endpoints, I think, would be sort of the hiccup in doing something like this. But like I said earlier, I think that from a performance perspective, this is not necessarily a concern we have. But I do think it would be neat if it were possible to sort of split up and recombine Augur databases. Um, but I think that from sort of a federation perspective, having the API be more robust would probably be a better way to achieve that, in my opinion.
So having the API capable, are you suggesting that making the API capable of executing a query that spans physical installations of Augur? Is that what you're suggesting, John?
Something similar to that, yeah. Like maybe not going to the level of having Augur instances talk directly to each other, but something of sort of the idea that like, you can have a request that you make to one Augur instance that returns data that you want from it, and then you can make another request to another Augur instance that returns the data you want from
Like you
it.
can split the same
And
request to multiple instances and then get different
yeah,
sets of data back and just sort of
yeah.
merge them.
And there are a lot of services that work like that. Like actually Cloudflare is a great example of this. When you make an HTTPS request to a Cloudflare domain, you're not necessarily connecting directly to the root server, and in fact, you almost never are. The requests are usually shared across multiple servers. And sometimes the servers, especially in terms of like regionalized instances where you'll have a different server for different markets, the same domain could connect to, any number of different endpoints. So I think that, in a really advanced scenario, that might be a kind of a solution to that. But the Augur API in terms of the metrics is quite robust. And so, um, if it's the metrics that people are interested in, or just like the raw data in the tables, then that's not necessarily, you know, I think it's already kind of accessible, especially because almost all of the metrics endpoints are unauthenticated. Um, which I think Sean is of the opinion that that must always stay the be the case, but
What must always be the case?
that the metrics endpoints don't require authentication.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that I've kind of shifted my thinking as I've seen some of the public instances API call load. So, I mean, I think having some kind of authentication that's fairly lightweight and solely really for the purpose of preventing any one person from crushing a server,
Yeah.
similar to
Just
how
like rate
GitHub.
limiting.
Yeah, really
Hmm.
basically for rate limiting so that if people want to do that, that's fine. Um, but we don't like make it free and open like it is right now. And I think sort
Hmm.
of the constraint that occurs when people are too greedy, like if they try to query all the data for all the repos, is that uh, we don't do any pagination with our query results. So
Hmm.
they're going to tend to time themselves out if they get too aggressive. Um,
Yeah. We
I'd also
really
be
do need to do that.
mhm.
Yeah, I was curious too with the discussion like, hey, how do we potentially combine databases? I almost wonder like if there's a way to do some kind of like if someone is looking for like, hey, I want all the metrics for all the databases or whatever, or all the repositories in this database, would it work to maybe add an endpoint or add some way for like for example like the hypothetical like cybersecurity research firm, they could request like basically a full database dump where it's just like, hey, maybe the server just dumps to SQL files and tarballs it up and sends that as the response or something. Um, I don't know if these databases are like so big that that wouldn't be sensible to send over HTTP, but or maybe you'd need to do other things. But
Um, I I mean, all of the requests occur over HTTP, but
yeah,
maybe I wasn't following exactly what you were saying.
no,
Well,
ignore that last part. I was
Huh. No,
yeah.
I think it's me not following, John.
So the question he had was maybe there's an endpoint we could implement that basically just dumps the entire database to SQL and then zips it up and then sends it as a file.
I
Um,
would I would say that would probably have to be more of a like a almost like social media does it, where if you want to download your data, you'd be able to just request that, but it would be something that would get queued up
Yeah.
for you and you'd be notified later. Like no RESTful API is going to
Yeah.
be able to marshal data that diverse and expansive in that way. Um,
How big
And
is
imagine you've got to
the
lock
public?
everything for the time that it's
yeah,
pulling all that data. Like no one else can read anything. Yeah.
I mean, for the public instance, an export of the database in PostgreSQL backup format is currently 1.6 terabytes. Um, so
So that the
that's
community instance is 1.6
yeah.
terabytes. Jeez.
If I the database dump of it is 1.6 terabytes, what it requires physically on a disk to then repopulate that database is around 4 terabytes. So I think for a lot of people that starts to exceed available disk space that they have for playing with things like this. It's over like some arbitrary limit that exists just in the configuration of the computers that most humans use today.
Yeah. That makes sense. That also helps get a sense of the scale because I wasn't quite sure what order of magnitude scale we were at here. I think I've been thinking of it a lot as a lot smaller than it is. Um,
Well, and you can have an Augur instance that's a lot smaller than that. And I
yeah.
think like as you talk, I mean, I'm trying to think, I think a proof of concept would be to like federate some look at federating some small part of Augur and the project that someone like you could do for a project scoped like a student capstone for a master's. I think the proof of concept for here's how you would federate a giant, massive shared database. Here's some techniques for doing it, and here's a simplified worked example that leverages the schema from Augur. And I think even just managing the insertion and creation of repositories on kind of a toy version of Augur would be an interesting capstone level project
And that
because
also reminds. Oh,
I think
sorry.
I think there'd be a lot to figure out.
Well, actually,
Um,
too, you guys were talking about like how in order to federate, you need sort of a more centralized kind of key management system.
yep.
And for
But
some reason, that reminds me, I've been recently getting involved in like creating a Blue Sky account and just getting involved in that. And I haven't dug too deeply into their like open AT proto that underlies the whole thing. But it seems
yeah,
like they're working with a very kind of shared heap model. They've got some key management stuff. Like I'm kind of that just made me think of like I wonder if I could take a lot of their tech, which is their entire platform is basically open source all the way up and down.
it is
Um,
pretty sweet how they've done that. Yeah.
so I'm really curious if like that could like because that's like kind of a mod like a new development in this sort of distributed system space and federated social media and all that. So I'm wondering like I think their stuff like if you actually go and visit the web page for someone's personal data server or whatever, like it's just data files. I don't know if there's anything that would restrict it to just being social stuff. Um,
So
so
what
that might be
I've
a cool way to kind of have like these Augur instances and people can host their own small ones, but they can all kind of see each other.
so I can speak to what Blue Sky is compared to what Augur is. So all these social platforms for the data that they share, it's relatively flat and simple in terms of everything being organized around the contributions or characteristics of any particular user, right? And so there isn't much nested relationship across the whole architecture. It's like a person and their stuff, and that's pretty straightforward. With Augur, you're dealing with a repository and its stuff. And I think that the trick would be that there's a lot of nesting of a lot of things, and there's multiple layers of nesting. So Blue Sky, I expect its data architecture in this federation. It basically looks like I have the person, and then there are many things like posts about that person, followers, people they're following. It kind of trails off pretty steeply after that. That's what they're looking at. And there's no nesting below the post per se, or maybe there's a little bit, but not very much. Whereas in Augur, you've got a repository and you've got its pull requests. And then that pull requests has comments and approval chains and status. so that the loop gets closed on that pull request at some juncture. And all of that data is always by repository kind of massive, and the tentacles reach out for at least 3 layers on that stuff, because then a pull request has many messages, but it also has many files and many commits that can be associated with it. And all those things are used to calculate different statistics. So that's not intended to say that something like this would not work. Um, but so I haven't dug into Blue Sky at all. What I suspect, however, is that they're using more of an open search kind of architecture where it's a lot of JSON objects physically stored inside something, and that lends itself well to web presentation, and I think less well to data analytics. So anyone that would want to, get Blue Sky data would have to figure that out. And I think the problem is a little bit different. Not entirely, but a little bit.
Well, I think that, using the app protocol directly might not have necessarily been what Adrian was talking about.
Okay.
Um, but maybe just taking inspiration from it, perhaps. But the bigger problem, I think, for federation is really coming up with a definition of what exactly that means. So you would have to decide basically like what does federation look like for an Augur instance, because really, you know, Augur has several layers going on. So at the base layer, you have the collection workers that are run as celery tasks. And those are interfacing both with external APIs and also the database. Um, and then other things that are neither of those, but related to other parts of Augur. And then you have the sort of the web server layer that talks to users and to the database, and also in some parts the workers. And then you have other processes that sort of are just long standing that exist for the duration of an Augur instance that have their own little jobs that they do. And then you have stuff like the CLI layer, which isn't persistent, so that's not really necessarily important for this discussion. So I think that if you wanted to look into trying to federate Augur, the first step would really be what does the federation model look like? What data is federated and how does it federate? Is really the first thing that you'd want to decide.
Yeah, that makes sense. I probably have a lot of reading to do in the next couple of days, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think you could use, I mean, I think you could use any system um, that's gathering data from diverse places and sharing it to accomplish this. The social media example, like Blue Sky, as I said, is a bit simpler. Um, but I would, like, in terms of like what you would do for a project, I would encourage you to keep it, and this is just me as kind of an advisor to master's students, you want to keep it to something that you can accomplish and show progress on, that's about the size of what a capstone would be. And I think the very idea of federating something like Augur, to me, that suggests that a very simple prototype of the most basic keys and how to federate them would be the example that would be sufficient for a master's capstone. And I come back to the first thing I thought of, which is, have people create collections of repositories on different instances, and then you'd have to have some kind of shared key server that would be introduced, and just kind of show and tell that simple worked example. And the place you could start would be just the repo table um, in the Augur database. I think repo and then the user tables, but yeah, I would start with a simple like example like that.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely don't want to like overdo it this semester because I tend to get ambitious and then like under deliver, which is probably not what I want to do with this. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, turning what Augur is today into something that is federated is a substantial effort that would require about a year from multiple developers. It would be very
Yeah.
cool in the end, but there'd, I think, be a good deal of work involved in getting there.
I think a year is a generous estimate.
Yeah, I always imagine optimistically the right team, and if you don't have
Yeah.
that, yeah, it could take longer.
Yeah, if we had six full-time paid developers working only on Augur, I think a year is a reasonable estimate for sure. Um, Unfortunately, that is not currently what we have.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds at least like there's also some like exit paths for this that aren't fully going to fully federating everything, where it's like, hey, now you've got this shared key thing. It makes it easier to combine two Augur databases, or like maybe split them apart. I don't know. That's probably another level of difficult on top of that, but it feels like there's
Mhm.
some intermediate steps that could be useful still to the ecosystem without necessarily having to fully federate everything.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think
I
so.
mean, we did recently start storing repo source IDs, so
Yeah,
that
which
might
is
be
a
useful,
that's a natural key for the GitHub and GitLab repositories, and they're unique to the platform. And so
we
those,
assume.
yeah, I mean they do seem to be. We have not encountered any counterfactual repositories yet. Nothing has broken that logic model at this point. So, and then I think even though they have the unique source ID from GitHub now persisted, that's not required, and it's something that will get right now in the path of execution. I think that occurs after the repo is added, although it can occur beforehand because it won't let you insert duplicate repos. Um, Sorry, I'm thinking out loud here. Yeah, so like something as simple as a service to federate the generation of Augur keys for each repo, because since we use the source key is like an organic root key for the repository on the platform. The key that Augur creates, however, even though it is like right now, that key, the identifier for a repository inside of Augur is unique to each instance, which would create a problem federating the data just because a lot of the underlying retrieval logic depends on that repository ID being unique. So like a service to ensure Augur key uniqueness across instances would be necessary just for that basic repository use case.
Are those keys just like an incrementing like integer, or is it more like a
That's all
U
it is.
UID?
It's just an incrementing. Um,
Yeah, we in the past, I have actually campaigned that all Augur keys should be deterministically created. And we did have a model at one point where we used UUIDs and we concatenated the there's a platform ID and then there's the repo ID and then there's like for stuff inside the repo, there's like the specific ID of that particular element of the repo, all sort of glued together so that each repo from a certain platform, i.e., like GitHub, would be globally unique across the entire world for that repo. And also, all Augur instances that had the same repo would use the same ID because they were all created deterministically. We abandoned that model a while ago. I don't remember exactly what happened with that, but I think that it basically just became unnecessary overhead that no one wanted to maintain.
there's
So,
so I was just you mentioning this, John, reminds me that the contributors data inside of Augur is actually managed with a UUID as the key. And those UUIDs are generated algorithmically, um, referencing I don't remember exactly how that the pieces of the UUID are generated. It's in the docs somewhere, but those UUIDs would be unique across
mhm.
Augur instances. And so the UUID example works, Uh, um, and we've refactored at some point in the last year and a half that part of Augur so that the identifiers are organically unique inside of Augur. And if we applied some kind of similar thinking to the repositories and other items, then, and obviously using UID keys, then they would be unique and also common across instances, which would make federation a bit easier.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think one of the things I also like with because I built like a little web service at the tail end of high school that is somehow still being used by my high school, but in that I was like, hey, how do I do IDs for this? And I think what I ended up I think I read somewhere about how like if you're just storing it as a string, like there's a little bit of a performance penalty for having to do like lookups on stuff like that if you've got a big database. And so I was like, hey, let's just store the UUID as bytes because then that's faster to look up. I ended up doing some random janky things to make that work, so I don't know if that's the best plan, but I'd be
Ran
curious if you because you mentioned the UUID model was largely abandoned because of like unnecessary overhead. So I'd be curious
Well,
if that.
so Postgres has native support for
Okay.
UUIDs, specifically 128-bit UUIDs. So that
Yep.
was not the performance impact was not necessarily the reason why that was abandoned.
Okay. I think
Um,
my project was using like MySQL or something. So that's
yeah.
probably where that came from then.
But yeah, I think maybe one possible step. I think one of the other issues, and I do remember this, one of the other issues with having the UUID model, that the way that I proposed it was because like we selected like sections of bytes inside of the UUID to assign to different external IDs. So like the first 4 bits or whatever would be like the platform, and then the next 8 bits would be like the sort of GitHub URL or something like that. Um, and I think that one issue with that is that there wasn't enough binary bits in the UID to give a unique ID to every class of data. For instance, like events are like 5 subcategories worth of data. And so there's not enough length in a UUID to fit that in. So maybe figuring out some other way to generate the UUIDs that doesn't involve just like allocating certain sections of bits to specific um elements of the ID would be helpful.
I don't know why my brain is now going to like create your deterministic ID just as a string of whatever length it ends up needing to be include all the data and then just like hash that and store the hash in the UUID or something. But
Yeah, that's definitely.
engineering brain's already trying to solve problems that aren't even in scope, probably.
well, I
I
mean,
think I
yeah.
think that's
Hmm.
actually a great idea. So maybe if you move forward with the project and need to solve that particular problem, that's great. Definitely one way to do it.
And hashing actually lends itself towards being having the it would allow us to provide more assurance that individually identifiable data is very difficult to extract. Um, and that's one of the goals is to ensure that privacy is respected. And so none of our APIs expose personally PII, personal identifying information. So the email addresses and the GitHub IDs are all not available through the API. And so obviously if you have database access, it is available. And that's another um, thing that Augur really needs to work out is how to ensure that that when we collect data, we ideally at the database level there would be some kind of obfuscation or encryption that not every Augur user would be able to see that PII data. Um, right now, if you have query access to a database, you could access PII, which is why everything that Augur does is generated through an API at this point. However, if we hashed it or did some other kind of use some other kind of technique to obfuscate the identifying keys, then that solves a separate problem, is my point. So these problems are intertwined is maybe the larger
Yeah.
point.
Systems, yay.
Yeah. So
I would like to
I
remind
hope
everyone, though, that security through obfuscation is not security.
that's right. No, very fair. Yeah, it gets to protecting the information of people and yeah.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a lot of good stuff to think about. So I'll probably end up pursuing something like that then, as far as some kind of like the key, either the key management thing or something like that. Uh, so yeah, I'll probably
Yeah.
be relatively active in the Slack chat for the next 10 to
Yeah.
12 weeks.
Yeah. And feel free to use the Augur 8 Knot channel on Slack as well to ask questions. Obviously we
Yeah,
only
that's the
meet
main
every
channel I've been existing in for the most part.
yeah, we only meet every couple of weeks right now here. So if you have questions in the time in between, that's a good place to get them answered, get those questions answered.
Awesome.
And
Sounds
I'm
good.
curious. I'm curious about a reference architecture for federating the Augur database. I think that's a very interesting technical problem.
Yeah, I was having all sorts of interesting ideas as far as like um just like generally like 'cause I think I was listening to a couple of the I don't remember which episodes of the Chaos podcast about, and I think it was mentioned a couple times of like one of the goals of Chaos is like to spread these metrics and make them more accessible and like kind of commonplace in the open source world. Um and I was like, I kind of wonder like I was briefly looking down the path of like I wonder if I could store this data in Git, because I found some old blog posts where some people were basically digging into the Git internals and realizing it's essentially just a content store and using it as essentially a NoSQL database, that's like fully versioned and everything. Which
Mhm.
I there was a bit of a leap to try and figure out how to get the very structured database of Augur to fit in that square hole or whatever. But like I was kind of just imagining like if this actually worked, like I want that could be maybe just like how the wikis tab of GitHub is backed by a Git database or Git repo. Maybe the insights tab could also be backed that way, and then like something like Augur or 8 Knot could just essentially Git clone all those little metrics, all those tiny metrics repositories and like combine them together or something. But that's also probably getting way out of scope for a capstone.
Probably. And, that is the reason that Augur is using a relational model because the NoSQL databases don't give you an opportunity to assess there's really no way to verify the completeness or
Yeah,
incompleteness of the data set in a NoSQL database because the computational cost, if you're reaching beyond 1,000 or so repositories, just becomes extraordinary. Um,
yeah,
because of the nature of a NoSQL database. So the reason Augur uses a SQL relational database is because that way we know that we don't have a bunch of pull request files, for example, for pull requests that we don't have, um, which is almost the default behavior in a NoSQL database that's pulling stuff in any order it thinks of pulling it into a NoSQL database. So it's possible, if not likely, that you will have these
yeah. Yeah,
weirdly
and I saw the
incomplete data sets.
Yeah, and I saw the docs too for like the like here's the Augur schema on one page, and I was like, oh wow, that's a lot more tables than I thought there were gonna be. So maybe this NoSQL thing's not gonna work. So yeah,
And,
that train of thought kind of died pretty quickly, but
yeah, and it's those relationships that they're the physical implementation of this nesting of things that I described. And
yeah,
so the keys in each of those tables ensure that if we can't get the leaves for branches that we haven't collected yet, right? So that whenever you see a data set or report from Augur, you can at least assume that it's it's coherent, that you won't have like 0 pull requests and 1,000 pull request files for a month, which makes no sense, but
Yeah.
can easily happen if you're not ensuring that you have the object above that object that it requires in your data set. Um,
See, I don't want to. I know it looks like we're maybe. Oh,
we're closing in
I
on
forget
the
the meetings end at 10:50. I keep thinking it's at
yeah.
like 11, but
No, we have 7 minutes left. Um, we could continue talking about this. I don't have any other items today, really.
I had another small thing, but I also want to like leave time if anyone else had other things to talk about. But I was also
John, do you
curious
have
if there's like, is there currently like monitoring or any kind of like metrics on just like the database, like the Augur databases itself, as far as like how big the storage is getting or how many repositories? Like, is there kind of stuff I could use to kind of benchmark against for some of these kind of
uh,
ideas with federating or U IDs and stuff?
I don't
when you
believe
say
so.
no, my thought process went to there is a set of queries that I use to uh, assess the completeness of our data collection, effectively using one of our tables, the repo info table, which pulls the metadata about how many pull requests and issues and commits are in any of the GitHub repositories, and then comparing that to the pull requests, issues, and commits that we have collected for that repository. That gives me an approximate indicator of completeness for each repository. I don't think we expose any of that information in an API right now, though it could be exposed in an API, and I think that's the forever road that we kind of arrive at quite frequently, which is okay, we know conceptually how we would do that. Now, do we have the time and is there enough need to go actually implement it? Right. And so implementing something like that's never been at the top of the priority
Yeah.
for the developers that we have. And it's hard for me to see. Well, I could see sometime in the next year it becoming an important enough question to ask for some of the larger public Augur instances as we continue the migration. So,
Okay.
but
I was more curious,
yeah,
like I think with I think that my question mostly just comes from my original plan of like, hey, let's federate the whole database. Like, how am I gonna for at least for the capstone paper purposes, like how am I gonna benchmark the before and after, like to show I actually improved something? Um,
Mhm.
but I think maybe that needs to change now if I'm mostly just doing like the key exchange or key deconflicting thing.
Yeah.
Um,
In terms of the database itself, Augur really does not pay any attention to that. So, like how many entries there are, or just even like what the size of the database is overall. Each worker, when it's doing its job, really only cares about the data that it is currently working on. And the front end is really the only part that sort of even attempts to gather all of the data at one time because it's necessary to sort of display, you know, at least for someone who isn't currently signed into their account, all of the repos in a list. So there are endpoints in Augur to gather like, how many repos are in this instance and how many, pull requests is in each repo in this instance and stuff like that. But there's not really um it wasn't designed for the purpose of like saying the database is this
yeah.
big.
So that'd be
It
more
was designed for
Postgres layer, kind of like do kind of that.
yeah,
Okay.
Mhm.
right. So this is a little bit out of date, actually. I think I need to update this because there is one additional column on this repo table, but it's the repo table where you would really begin. Um, Enter. So yeah, it's that, and so effectively figuring out how we would generate a repo ID here, that would be unique. And if we converted that to a UUID, is that the best way to do it? Or do we want to have some kind of federated service that generates an integer? Probably the UUID is going to be more robust against it, like a service being down. I don't know, John's thoughts are.
Um, Sorry, I was distracted by something going on outside. What was the question?
So for generating the repo IDs, like I think starting with the repo table as the logical place to begin thinking about federation. And the first thing to think about then is how would this repo ID be transformed? And I think there are two ways.
Mhm.
The UUID technique that kind of embeds information about the repo into that repo ID that
Mhm.
Augur generates, or some kind of federated service for gathering a bunch of repo IDs for a particular Augur instance, and then that instance owns those integer identifiers. I think I was
Yeah.
suggesting the UUID strategy would be more robust um,
Yeah,
against like
the
services being down or whatever.
having a hashed ID is great because you have essentially unlimited room for information because the chance of a hash collision is very, very low. But using the UUID with the information embedded directly into it is really nice for a couple of reasons. Primarily because just by looking at the ID, you can see information about the origin of it. Because you can see,
Mhm.
like, oh, this is the platform, this is the repo ID, this is the pull request ID, or whatever. And you sort of you implicitly understand information about it without having to make any other lookups. So, those are the two main benefits to each type. One of them is much more extensible because you have, the hashing algorithm essentially generates free bit space. And then the second one is the I can't think of the word for it, but it pedigree. That's close enough. It determines the ID itself embeds the pedigree of the data. Um,
Yeah, provenance might be the fancy data word that we use.
that's what I was trying to think
Yeah,
of. Provenance. Yeah, I knew it
yeah,
started with a P. I just
yeah.
couldn't remember it
That's
off the top of my
it's,
head.
it's one of those words that doesn't occur very often
Hmm.
in human
Yeah,
conversation.
for sure.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah,
Well, we're
and
actually,
in
go ahead, John.
I was going to say, just in terms of, the federating the data, there's examples in Augur of sort of centralized workers. So if you wanted something to like look at in terms of like what would a process even look like to like start up and do this sort of thing, we can definitely point you in the direction of that.
Yeah, I mean, anything you guys have that would be like any kind of useful information or information you think would be useful, it would be great. I realize
Mhm.
we're kind of at time, so we could probably
Yes, we
just
are.
continue in Slack. But I was also curious if there's a list of public Augur instances out there somewhere. But we can
There,
probably do that
there,
in Slack.
there is, yeah, I don't think there is anymore. We used to maintain that, but we haven't maintained it in the recent past. So the two public instances I am aware of are the one that is the quote unquote community public instance, and the other that is the Red Hat public instance. However, those will be probably one instance here uh, in the next month or so.
If you wanted a look into how massive the primary public instances, it's at ai.chaos.io. And in the front end, if you're not signed in, it shows you all of the repos. for the entire database. So and then there's a pagination bar at the top, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just to select the pages. So if you just sort of scroll over on that while you're not logged in,
And
you'll see how many
it's
pages there are.
it's not
Oh, dang.
intuitive how to do that, but it's this little bar
Yeah,
here.
I was about to say like there's no horizontal scroll, and then I found it. So yeah.
It's super tiny, yeah. But
Yeah.
there are 4,573 pages and 25 repos per page.
Looks
So
like there's on the screen it's like 114,000
Yeah.
repositories. Dang.
Yeah.
Is
There's
that just the
even,
Augur? That's just the community instance. That's not including the Red
yeah,
Hat stuff.
right. Although I think nearly everything in the Red Hat instance is here in some manner. Let's
so in
see.
terms of like how big an Augur instance can get, this is like the prime example of that, I think.
Yeah. And that adds up because there's 104, that 4573 times 25 is 114,325, which is approximately what I think is in the public instance. So it checks.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'll look into this all and then be doing a whole bunch of reading.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, thank you guys so much. I know, sorry for
All right.
running things a little over time.
No, no, it's all right. I think it's good. I mean, watches this, will probably learn something. So thank you all, and I'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.